What would happen if a CEO disguised himself as an ordinary customer and discovered that his own employees were living in fear? And what would he do when he realized that the truth was not just the fault of one person, but the result of an entire corrupt system? The morning in Dallas was hotter than usual, the sky covered with a thin layer of clouds that made the sunlight feel harsher, almost irritable. Ethan Cross stood in front of the large glass window of a Crossfire Burgers branch, quietly observing every movement inside. He was not just an ordinary customer, nor a new trainee. He was the founder, the man who had turned the name Crossfire Burgers into one of the most recognized chains across the southern United States. But this morning, he wasn't here for sales reports or photo ops with top employees. He came as an anonymous customer, dressed in a faded button-up shirt, worn-out jeans, and old sneakers, a baseball cap pulled low to shadow his forehead. The disguise wasn't elaborate, but it was enough to make him just another face in the crowd, someone no employee would recognize. As Ethan pushed open the door, the familiar chime rang and the smell of freshly grilled burgers and crispy fries hung in the air. But as he stepped past the order counter, the first thing he noticed wasn't the signature aroma of the food that had built his empire. It was the heavy, oppressive atmosphere that seemed to weigh down every step. Conversations were nearly non-existent. The only sounds were the sizzle of frying oil, the sharp beeps of the cash register, and the occasional scrape of chairs against the floor. A restaurant full of customers felt more like a room where someone had turned the volume down to near silence. He approached the counter and ordered the simplest thing on the menu, a cheeseburger and a soda. The young cashier in front of him, her hair neatly tied back, wore a smile so stiff it looked glued onto her face and her eyes betrayed her tension. The small name tag pinned to her chest read Megan Holt. Ethan handed over his internal corporate payment card, a card reserved only for senior management, which was never supposed to be declined. It wasn't just a way to pay. It was a tool, a sign of authority he used to test any branch without prior notice. Megan held the card carefully with both hands, trying to look composed, but her fingers trembled slightly. The scanner beeped, then flashed a harsh red message on the screen. Transaction denied. Megan froze for a second, her eyes darting nervously toward the back of the counter, where a tall man stood with arms crossed, leaning against the wall. He didn't need to speak. A single glance from him was enough to make Megan stiffen as if frozen in place. Ethan noticed immediately. That man, with his cold demeanor and eyes sharp as a blade, was the type who made employees too afraid to even breathe loudly. The name tag on his chest read, Quinn Barrett. "Sorry your card was declined," Megan said, her voice so soft it was almost a whisper, as if terrified someone else might hear. Ethan tilted his head slightly, offering her a polite smile. It was a calm, courteous smile, but beneath it, his mind was already racing. This card could not be declined unless it had been intentionally disabled at the system level. Someone had tampered with it, and that was no coincidence. He looked directly at Megan, his tone still gentle. "That's fine. I'll pay in cash." Pulling a few bills from his wallet, he paid the exact amount and accepted the receipt along with Megan's nervous, mumbled thanks. She quickly lowered her head, her eyes still flicking toward Quinn, as if his presence loomed over every movement she made. Ethan carried his tray to a secluded corner at the back of the restaurant. He didn't start eating right away, instead setting the tray down and letting his eyes drift casually across the room, though every glance was deliberate. Customers came and went, but no one smiled. No one spoke more than a few words. Behind the counter, employees worked like machines, taking orders, pressing buttons, handing over food. No one dared to sigh or frown, even for a moment. Quinn stayed where he was, doing nothing, yet his mere presence turned the entire restaurant into an invisible prison. Ethan took a sip of soda, the mild sweetness spreading across his tongue, but it did nothing to ease the discomfort rising in his chest. He didn't need to ask anyone. He already knew something here was seriously broken. Not the machines, not the procedures, something deeper, people. And this wasn't random. It was controlled. Someone was pulling the strings. And this morning, with just one declined card swipe, Ethan Cross had stepped into a dangerous game inside the very chain of restaurants that bore his name. Ethan sat in the far corner, his baseball cap pulled low, shadowing his eyes as they scanned the room with quiet precision. He broke off a small piece of his burger but didn't eat it, letting the melted cheese cool untouched. Every sense was heightened, every detail absorbed like a detective combing through a crime scene. The restaurant was packed, every seat taken, yet the atmosphere felt more like a funeral home than a bustling fast food chain. There was no laughter, no cheerful greetings, only the hiss of oil frying, the dry beeps of the cash register, and the occasional scrape of chairs. Even the children, who normally filled such places with noise, sat unusually still, glancing timidly at their parents, as if they too sensed the tension pressing down on the room. Ethan's eyes moved to the counter where Megan was working. The young cashier's forced smile twitched at the corners of her mouth, her lips trembling slightly, as if held in place by invisible strings. Every time a customer thanked her, she gave the required response, "Thank you." But her voice was flat, stripped of warmth. Her fingers tapped the order screen nervously, occasionally hitting buttons twice before confirming an item. Ethan noticed immediately, because he knew those small tremors didn't come from physical exhaustion, they were born of fear. Just a few steps away stood Quinn Barrett, leaning casually against the wall, arms crossed. He barely spoke, but the occasional cold glance he cast at the staff was enough to make them stiffen instantly, their movements tightening as they scrambled to avoid mistakes. A young employee carrying a tray passed by, the edge of a soda cup tipping slightly, a few drops spilling over the rim. Ethan saw the boy's face pale, his head bowing repeatedly as he muttered apologies, as if a single drop of soda might cost him his job. Quinn didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. Instead, he spoke slowly, his tone dull and cutting, like a blunt knife scraping skin. "Next time, if you're not careful, you won't need to come back here." The boy whispered a quick, "Yes, sir," then nearly sprinted back to the kitchen, his shoulders trembling with each hurried step. Ethan watched, his eyes glinting with cold anger, but he kept his head down, maintaining the image of an ordinary customer. He tapped his fingers lightly against the table, a habit when he was deep in thought. This wasn't just the result of one strict manager or a poorly run shift. This was fear, carefully cultivated, deliberately maintained. The synchronized silence wasn't accidental, it was like an unspoken law etched into every employee's mind. And the most disturbing part was that this oppressive atmosphere controlled everyone without the need for explicit threats. When a customer smiled politely at Megan and said, "Thank you," Ethan studied her face closely. The smile stayed on her lips, but her eyes were lifeless, hollow, as if shattering for just a second. In that brief moment, Ethan felt as though he was looking into the eyes of someone who wasn't truly living, just surviving day by day. He raised his soda, taking a slow sip, his eyes narrowing slightly. This wasn't just a branch with poor management. This was an invisible cage, and Quinn Barrett wasn't the only one holding the key. Ethan leaned back in his chair, letting his gaze drift casually around the room, committing every detail to memory: the employees' averted eyes, their nervous glances, the unnatural quiet of the customers. Every piece was another fragment of a much larger picture he was slowly assembling. And deep down, Ethan knew that when that picture was finally complete, it wouldn't just reveal Quinn Barrett, it would expose something much darker, controlled by forces far beyond this single restaurant. The afternoon crept by, the crowd inside never thinning, but Ethan noticed something strange. No one lingered. No one enjoyed their meal. People ate quickly, their eyes fixed on their trays, as if desperate to leave without drawing attention. A fast food restaurant should have been filled with chatter and laughter, but this place felt like a pressure chamber, a room where everyone was holding their breath. Ethan kept up his act as just another customer, quietly taking a few bites of his burger while his eyes never left the counter. Megan Holt still worked with that stiff, unnatural smile. Her fingers hovered nervously over the order screen, tapping twice, sometimes even 3 times before confirming a meal. Every time she handed a tray to a customer, her eyes darted briefly toward the kitchen, as if someone was watching her every move. Quinn Barrett remained in the same spot, motionless, arms crossed, looming over the room like a dark shadow. A single furrow of his brow was enough to make employees tighten their movements instantly. Ethan filed that detail away. This wasn't ordinary shift supervision. It was control, deliberate and suffocating, like an unspoken law being enforced. When Ethan received his tray, his eyes caught a detail most customers would overlook. A receipt lay next to the register, and in the split second he glanced at it, he saw something significant. The shift supervisor's name printed in bold, Jared Lane. Ethan's brow furrowed slightly. He had been there for nearly an hour, and it was obvious Jared Lane wasn't present. Quinn Barrett had been in charge the entire time, never moving from his spot since Ethan arrived. It was a glaring inconsistency. Crossfire Burgers maintained strict scheduling, and the name of a supervisor on duty never mismatched reality by mistake. This wasn't an error. It was deliberate. Someone had manipulated the system, hiding who was actually in control. Ethan picked up an old receipt discarded under a table, pretending to wipe his hands as he checked it. Every single one carried the same name, Jared Lane. A carefully crafted deception designed to falsify reports. Ethan sipped his soda slowly, his eyes scanning the room. Megan continued working, her tension unmistakable, and in that moment, her hand trembled slightly as she handed a tray to a customer. It lasted barely a second, but Ethan caught the look in her eyes, the look of someone who knew every move was being watched, every gesture judged. Standing up to throw away some trash, Ethan discreetly pulled out his phone, snapping a photo of the receipt with the incorrect supervisor name, saving it as evidence. This was no longer speculation. That single, seemingly minor detail confirmed what he already suspected. Someone was deliberately covering up the truth, and Quinn Barrett was just a cog in a much darker machine. Returning to his table, Ethan sat down, his gaze narrowing slightly. He knew that once you found a piece like this, the larger picture would begin to form, and he was ready to follow it, no matter how deep it went, no matter how dark the truth waiting for him might be. Ethan stood, carrying his tray toward the trash area, but he didn't leave right away. Instead, he positioned himself near a table against the wall, close enough to catch snippets of conversation from the staff. In places like this, whispered words were often worth far more than the monthly reports filled with numbers he was used to reading. At that moment, a young employee stepped out from the kitchen, a rag in hand. His eyes darted nervously, shoulders hunched like a small animal constantly on alert for predators. Ethan recognized him instantly, Tyler Brooks, a new face he hadn't seen listed in any of the staff rosters before. Tyler wiped the table slowly, distracted, his movements betraying that his mind was elsewhere, clearly weighed down by something troubling. Quinn Barrett appeared behind him like a looming shadow. He didn't raise his voice, instead leaning in close to Tyler's ear, his tone low and cold. "Put the rag down. When you're done with this row, you're cleaning the bathrooms. You're on duty there today." Tyler stiffened, glancing up hesitantly. "But I was assigned to the counter today." Before he could finish, Quinn's stare cut him off. The man didn't yell, he didn't need to. His words came slow and deliberate, each one like a death sentence. "You think you get to choose what you do here? Listen carefully. If you don't learn to bow your head now, you won't last." Tyler's head dropped immediately, his shoulders trembling as he quickly moved away. Ethan watched, his hands tightening around the tray. This wasn't just verbal control, it was humiliation, quiet and calculated. This was how fear spread most effectively. As Tyler moved to clean the table near Ethan, Ethan leaned slightly toward him, lowering his voice like a curious customer making casual conversation. "Rough place to work, huh? You look tense." Tyler froze, eyes widening with alarm as if terrified someone might overhear. He glanced around quickly before whispering, his voice shaky. "They call it a test, but it's not training. It's punishment. Here, if they can't break you early, they won't believe you're loyal." Ethan stayed silent, his eyes fixed on his burger as if uninterested, but inside, a quiet fire flared hotter. He was about to ask more when another employee walked past. The young man, barely in his 20s, avoided eye contact, but as he passed close to Ethan, he tilted his head slightly, his words so soft They were almost a breath. People who ask too many questions here usually disappear from the schedule. Fast. The young man kept walking, never pausing, as if nothing had happened. Ethan didn't look after him, only set his tray down and wiped his hands with a napkin, maintaining the illusion of a casual customer. But in his mind, the pieces were beginning to fall into place. The vague warnings, the fearful glances, everything was forming a picture darker than he had imagined. Something organized, something strong enough to trap every employee in absolute silence. Ethan took a sip of his soda, his eyes still lowered, but inside, his determination sharpened to steel. He could already smell the truth, and it was stronger, heavier, and far more toxic than any burger aroma in this room. Inside the kitchen, the steady sizzle of grilling meat echoed rhythmically, each slice flipped with precise, deliberate movements. Ethan watched closely from his spot and noticed something different. Among the employees rushing about, heads lowered, avoiding Quinn's gaze, there was one man who worked with a calmness that stood out. It was Adrian Cole, the veteran head chef Ethan had read about in old reports. Adrian was in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, his arms strong, and every motion he made was firm and deliberate, like a craftsman shaping something precious. He didn't flinch, not even when Quinn passed by. His eyes remained steady, never lowering, never bowing. Ethan immediately knew this was not someone who could be easily intimidated. He waited for the right moment as the lunch rush began to ease, then left his corner, pretending to approach the counter for more napkins but positioning himself near Adrian. "You seem pretty good at what you do," Ethan said casually, sounding like a curious customer making small talk. Adrian glanced at him, his eyes showing none of the fear the other employees carried. "Just doing what needs to be done," he replied briefly, flipping a piece of meat on the grill with practiced ease. Ethan leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice as if speaking idly. "I've heard this isn't exactly an easy place to work." Adrian's hands hesitated for just a second, but his expression didn't change. He wrapped a burger neatly, his tone flat, as if discussing the weather. "Not easy. This isn't work. This is survival. You say the wrong thing to the wrong person, and you disappear from the schedule just like that." Ethan's eyes stayed on Adrian while the chef continued working as if nothing unusual was being said. Ethan pressed a little further, his voice lower. "And you're not afraid of disappearing?" Adrian paused for a brief moment, then looked straight into Ethan's eyes for the first time, his tone steady, his words firm. "I've been here long enough to learn one thing. Fear doesn't save anyone. It just kills you slower." Ethan felt the weight of those words, knowing Adrian wasn't the type to speak lightly. Deciding to push a little further, he asked, "Have you ever seen anything unusual, things that don't follow the rules?" Adrian didn't respond right away. He finished wrapping a burger, set it on a tray, and only then spoke slowly, his gaze fixed on his work. 3 times. I saw Quinn taking money from the register after closing. No records, no receipts. Every time, all it took was a quiet word to the shift manager, and it was as if nothing had ever happened. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly around the napkin in his hand. That statement was a crucial piece of the puzzle. "You're certain?" Adrian finally looked him directly in the eye, his expression calm but unyielding. "I don't speak unless I'm certain. But if you're smart, you'll understand words don't mean much here. If you want to expose him, find your own proof. I've done my part. I'm still standing here, and I haven't bowed." Ethan nodded slightly, masking the sharp glint in his eyes behind a polite, casual smile. He understood. Adrian had laid the truth on the table. The rest was up to him. And Ethan knew this was only the beginning of a dangerous investigation he was prepared to follow to the very end. In the late afternoon, the restaurant began to thin out. Ethan chose this moment to approach Megan. He rose from his corner seat, carrying his empty tray, and walked toward the counter. Megan was reviewing order logs, her movements slow, her eyes darting toward the kitchen every few seconds, as if afraid Quinn might suddenly appear behind her. Ethan set his tray on the counter, leaning forward slightly, speaking in the warm tone of a friendly customer. "Thank you, the food was great. You've been working here for a while, haven't you?" Megan looked up briefly, her stiff smile flickering into place, but her eyes still held that unmistakable fear. "Yes, I've been here for some time," she said quietly, as if trying not to draw attention. Ethan lowered his voice further, leaning in just slightly. "You look tired. It must be stressful working here, isn't it?" Megan froze for a split second, biting her lip, her fingers pausing on the screen. She didn't answer, but Ethan noticed her shoulders trembling slightly. He continued gently, keeping his tone calm. "I'm guessing it's not just the busy shifts, it's something else, isn't it?" Her eyes widened briefly, a spark of resistance flashing and then fading just as quickly. She took a slow breath, her gaze shifting away. I shouldn't say anything." Her words were fragile, but Ethan heard the weight behind them. This was someone standing at the edge of silence, holding back too long. He offered her a reassuring smile, setting the tray aside, his voice soft but firm. "You don't need to explain everything. Just tell me, do you have any proof?" Megan stiffened, staring at him in surprise. After a long moment of hesitation, she reached into her pocket, pulling out her phone, keeping it low beneath the counter. Her hand shook, but she unlocked the screen and showed it to him, whispering so quietly it was almost inaudible. "I kept this because I hoped one day someone would believe me." Ethan glanced quickly at the screen. Photos of shift schedules filled it. Megan's name appeared repeatedly in 8-hour blocks, but when compared to the official system, only 5 hours were logged. She swiped to the next image, a weekly pay statement, short by nearly $70. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "It's like this every week. I can't even pay my rent. I asked, and they just said it's a system glitch, but they never fix it." A chill ran through Ethan, not because of the stolen money, but because of how deliberate it was, systematic, refined, and ongoing long enough to crush someone into despair. He looked at Megan. Her eyes brimmed with tears, her lips pressed tightly together to hold back a sob, but one tear slipped free, landing on the phone screen. "They always ask me what mistake I made, never once if the system could be wrong," she said, her voice breaking. Ethan said nothing, only rested his hand lightly on the counter, his gaze locked with hers, a look not of a casual customer, but of someone who understood. For the first time, Megan gave a small nod, as if finally lowering the wall she had held up for so long, and Ethan knew he had just received the most critical piece of the puzzle, a witness, and the beginning of everything to come. That night, Ethan sat alone in a small hotel room just a few blocks from the Dallas branch. The dim yellow light cast sharp shadows across his face, highlighting the hardened lines and the steely focus in his eyes. On the table, his laptop glowed, open to the high-level internal management system accessible only to people like him, the founder of Crossfire Burgers. He began pulling reports from the last 3 months, focusing on branches across the southern region. The numbers poured in rapidly, and within minutes, Ethan spotted a troubling pattern. Dallas, Austin, Baton Rouge, even San Antonio all showed consistently lower actual revenue compared to standard projections, while ingredient costs had risen abnormally. At the same time, employee payrolls were repeatedly edited manually, with vague notes marked as technical adjustments and no detailed explanations. He entered an advanced filter command, and the result flashed across the screen like an ugly stain. Every single one of these branches had been approved by the same name, Reed Vickers, the Southern Regional Director, renowned for his cost-cutting measures and praised publicly for optimizing profits. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his gaze darkening. "This isn't a mistake, this is a plan," he muttered under his breath. Everything fit together too perfectly. Wage manipulation, fear to silence the staff, cash skimming. It was all part of a rotten machine hidden behind seemingly legitimate numbers. A soft knock at the door made Ethan turn his head. He rose, opened the door, and standing there was Adrian Cole, calm as ever, but his eyes sharper than usual. "I'm guessing you're not here just to eat burgers," Adrian said plainly, stepping inside when Ethan gestured for him to enter. They sat across from each other, and Adrian placed a small, worn black USB drive on the table. "I'm not supposed to have this," he said slowly, his voice low, "but I kept it, in case one day someone had the guts to do the right thing." Ethan picked it up, his eyes flickering with determination. "What's on it?" Adrian looked straight at him, his tone flat but heavy. "Security footage from 2 weeks ago." That night, Quinn stayed after closing. He opened the safe and took more than $500. No receipt, no report. The next morning, the closing records were edited. Ethan took a deep breath, his hand gripping the USB like a heavy stone. He knew exactly how valuable this was. This wasn't hearsay, it was hard evidence. "Why did you keep this?" he asked. Adrian's gaze lowered to the table, his voice weary but firm. "Because I'm tired, Ethan. Tired of watching good people disappear from the schedule. Tired of watching people like Quinn and Vickers grow rich off our fear. I didn't keep it to save myself. I kept it hoping someone brave enough would save everyone else." Ethan studied Adrian for a long moment. In the man's calm eyes, he saw both exhaustion and resolve. "You've waited long enough," Ethan said finally, his voice dropping into a deep, steady tone. "I won't let this continue." Adrian gave a small nod, and for the first time, the corner of his mouth lifted into the faintest of smiles, but it was a smile filled with hope. Ethan slipped the USB into his jacket pocket, his gaze sharpening to steel. From this moment on, he knew this was no longer a quiet investigation. He had stepped into a real battle, and his opponent wasn't just Quinn Barrett, it was the entire system Reed Vickers had built. The next morning, Ethan no longer disguised himself as an ordinary customer. He arrived at the Southern Regional headquarters in a sharp, dark gray suit, his tie perfectly knotted, each step echoing firmly against the polished marble floor. The receptionist greeted him with polite nods, but none of them recognized who he was to them. He was just another successful businessman there to meet with the regional director. Ethan remained silent, heading straight to the top floor where Reed Vickers' office awaited. The glossy walnut door swung open. Reed Vickers sat behind an expansive desk, dressed in an expensive tailored suit, his hands clasped together, a smug smile curling his lips. "Ethan Cross," Vickers said smoothly, as though welcoming an old friend. "I've heard you've been stirring up some trouble in Dallas." Ethan didn't sit. He stood tall, his gaze sharp as a blade. "Trouble? Yes, but not caused by me. You did this, Vickers, and I have all the proof I need." He pulled a black USB drive from his jacket pocket and placed it firmly on the desk. Vickers' smile faltered slightly, but his tone remained casual. "You think a few video clips can hurt me? Ethan, this company survives on silence and discipline. Fear makes employees work harder. I'm simply doing what's necessary to keep profits up." Ethan's mouth tightened into a thin line, his voice low and commanding. "Discipline? You call stealing wages, forcing people to work in fear, and skimming cash from registers discipline? This isn't the company I built. I started with a small burger stand, and it grew because of trust, not threats." Vickers leaned back in his chair, his eyes turning cold, his tone dropping to a chilling calm. "You're naive. The world doesn't run on kindness. And if you're smart, you'll walk away from this. Sometimes, to maintain an empire, you have to turn a blind eye. Believe me, Ethan, letting things stay the way they are is better for everyone." Ethan stepped closer, placing his hand on the desk, his voice hard as steel. "Better for who? People like you? No, Vickers, I won't turn a blind eye to this rot. I didn't build Crossfire Burgers to turn it into a cage that traps people in fear. You've turned this company into a machine of exploitation, and I'm going to stop it." The room fell silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Vickers stared at Ethan for a long moment before his smile returned, colder and more calculating than before. "You really want a war with me? Fine, Cross, be ready." And Cross, But remember this, I don't lose." Ethan didn't flinch. He picked up the USB from the desk, his eyes unwavering. "A war? You're right. This will be a war, but this time, justice wins." Without another word, he turned and walked out, leaving Vickers sitting behind his desk, his smirk twisting with quiet malice. As the door closed behind him, Ethan drew a deep breath. He knew that from this moment on, this was no longer a quiet investigation, this was an open battle. and he had just officially declared war. It took less than 48 hours for the entire Crossfire Burger system to begin to crumble. Ethan sat in his temporary office in Dallas, his laptop screen flickering with constant updates. Major news outlets were running the story, headlines flooding social media, systemic exploitation of employees at Crossfire Burgers, managers caught embezzling cash. Alongside those headlines was the photo of Megan, her eyes still red and a tear streaking down her cheek, taken during her first interview with the local press. That single image was spreading faster than any advertisement the company had ever paid for. Hashtags exploded across Twitter and Facebook. Hashtag Stand with Megan. Hashtag Justice for Crossfire staff. More and more stories surfaced as employees from other branches began sharing their experiences. Unpaid overtime, subtle threats, pay mysteriously cut without explanation. In a single night, thousands of angry comments appeared online, and customers were calling for a boycott of all branches managed by Reed Vickers. Ethan watched the stream of headlines scroll across the screen in silence. There was no sense of triumph in his expression, no satisfaction. This was not a victory. It was only the beginning of a much larger war. But at least, the light was finally piercing the darkness that Reed Vickers had kept hidden for so many years. The phone on his desk buzzed. A message from the legal department appeared. Quinn Barrett has been suspended immediately and is under criminal investigation. Vickers has been temporarily removed from his position as regional director. Ethan narrowed his eyes, setting the phone back on the desk, his hands clasped tightly as he thought. These were only pawns. The biggest piece on the board was still standing, but he knew he was on the right path. Another message came through, this time from Megan. Thank you. For the first time in months, I feel like someone sees me. Ethan read the words slowly, then typed back a simple but resolute reply. It's not just you. Everyone will be seen. Outside, the Dallas sky was gray, light rain pattering softly against the glass window. Ethan rose from his chair, staring out at the city where neon signs and billboards flickered against the damp streets. Crossfire Burgers had once been his pride, a symbol of connection and community, but now it was a stain in the eyes of the public. Ethan clenched his fist, determination flashing in his eyes. The storm had begun, and he wouldn't stop with just a few names being taken down. He would tear apart the entire rotten system, even if it meant bringing the whole empire crashing down and rebuilding it from the ground up. 3 weeks after the media storm, Dallas glowed under the gentle light of an autumn morning. Sunlight streamed through the clear glass windows of the Crossfire Burgers branch, a place once suffocating with fear, now alive with laughter and energy. Ethan stepped inside, no longer in disguise. He wore a simple shirt, no suit, no tie, his face relaxed, though his eyes were still as sharp as ever. He wasn't alone. Beside him was a little girl, no older than 8, her wide, curious eyes darting around, taking in everything. It was Emma, his daughter. "Daddy, why is everyone smiling?" Emma asked, her voice innocent but full of wonder. Ethan crouched down slightly, smiling as he gently ruffled her soft hair. "Because now they finally get to work in a place they love, not a place they fear every day." The girl nodded, gripping her father's hand tighter, her eyes shining as she watched the employees chatting happily behind the counter. Megan Holt stood at the register, but she was no longer the young woman with a forced, nervous smile. She wore a new uniform, and beneath her name tag was a new title, Assistant Manager. Her eyes sparkled with confidence, her smile warm and genuine as she greeted customers. In the kitchen, Adrian Cole worked with his usual calm focus, but now he was instructing younger staff, his voice patient and steady with authority. He had recently been appointed training advisor for management, and his experience and integrity had become the foundation for a new generation of employees. Ethan sat in a familiar corner, the same spot where he had once silently observed everything. But this time, the feeling was different. The restaurant no longer carried the weight of silence or the shadows of fear. Laughter rang out from the kitchen. Employees teased one another as they worked. Customers talked and laughed, and even the smell of the fresh burgers seemed richer than before. Leaning back slightly, Ethan watched the scene. At one moment, Megan caught his gaze. She gave a small, heartfelt smile, bowing her head slightly, and Ethan smiled back. No words were needed. Both understood everything had changed. Emma tilted her head, her curious eyes fixed on him. "Daddy, this is your restaurant, isn't it?" Ethan looked around slowly, then answered in a warm, steady voice. "No, sweetheart. Crossfire Burgers isn't mine anymore. It belongs to the people brave enough to speak out and protect each other. It belongs to them." He took a sip of soda, his eyes following Adrian as he guided a young staff member, and Megan patiently explaining an order to a customer. In that moment, Ethan felt a sense of relief deeper than anything he had felt before. The first major battle had been won, and the future of Crossfire Burgers would no longer be built on fear, but on trust, respect, and the dignity of honest people. A soft autumn breeze drifted through the doorway, carrying the sound of laughter that filled the restaurant. Ethan leaned back in his chair, a quiet spark of hope glinting in his eyes. This isn't the end. It's only the beginning. This story reveals an important truth. A business is only truly strong when it is built on trust and respect, not on fear. People like Ethan, Megan, and Adrian are living proof that speaking up can sometimes save not just yourself, but change an entire system. If you also believe that justice is always worth fighting for, hit like and subscribe so we can continue bringing you inspiring stories like this one. And don't forget to leave a comment with the words "Dare to Speak Up," because every great change begins with one small, courageous voice.